Chapter 22 of The Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician by Edwin Lester Arnold. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He who has not left something sad behind him, and re-woke in the sunshine to feel the golden elixir of health and happiness moving in his veins anew, may take it that he has at least one pleasure yet unspent. I opened my eyes the next morning in as sweet a frame of contentment as anyone could wish for. They had put me to sleep in a chamber in that same wing of the rearward buildings where slept Elizabeth and her father. Thus, when I roused, the yellow sun was pouring in at my lattice, rich with sweet country scents, and the April air was swaying the white curtains, hung by dainty female hands across the diamond panes, with youth and sweetness in every breath. I lay and basked in it, and lazily wondered what all this changing fortune might mean. Where had I got to ? Who was I ? I turned about and stared upon the smooth white walls of the little room, patterned and tinselled with the dancing sunshine from outside, then gazed at the great carved columns of my four-post bedstead, then to the head, where, in a wide wooden field, were blazoned old Faulkener's arms and cognizance. I turned to all the chairs, dusted so clean and set back true and straight, to the ewer and the basin, full of limpid water from the well that caught the morning shine and threw a dancing constellation of speckled light upon the ceiling. I wondered even at the bare floor, scrubbed until there was no spot upon it, and the snowy furniture of my couch, and those downy pillows upon which I presently sank back in luxurious indolence. Was I indeed that rude rough captain of a grizzled cohort, with sinews of steel and frame impervious to the soft touch of pleasure, who only yesterday had burst through all the glittering phalanxes of France, and cut away with that arm that lay supine upon the coverlet right down through the thickets of their spears to where the white fleur-de-lis flashed in their midmost shelter? Could I be that same wanderer who, down the devious ways of chance, had tried 1,000 ventures, and slept in palaces and ditches, and drank from the same cup with kings and the same trough with outlaws? I laughed and stretched, and presently gave over speculating and rose. I washed and dressed, and went to the lattice and looked forth. It was as sweet a morning as you could wish for. The tepid sunshine spread over everything. Fleecy clouds were floating overhead upon the softest of winds. The sweet new varnished leaves were glittering in the dew upon every bush. The small birds singing far and near, the kine lowing as they went to grass, and the distant cock crowed proudly from his vantage point among the straw, and everything seemed fair, fresh, and happy in that budding season. I had not been luxuriating in the sweet leisure many minutes when by below came Mistress Bess, with cheeks like roses and kerchief whiter than snow, and brown unstranded hair that lifted on the breeze, a very fair vision indeed. That maid tripped across the grass and down the cobblestones, rattling the shiny milk pan she was carrying until she caught sight of me and stopped below my window. Then, saucy, she began, " How looks the world from there, sir? A little too young and chilly for your tenderness. Get back a bed, it will presently be June, and then no doubt more nicely suited to your valour's mind." " Nay, but, lady," I explained, " I was enjoying the morning air, and just coming to seek you." " That were 1,000 pities," she laughed. " The sun has not yet been up more than some poor hour or two, and the world is not yet nicely warmed. You might have a chill, and that were much to be deplored. Besides, a silken suit is rarely needed where work has to be done. Back to thy nests, apprentice, back to thy nest, and I'll send old Margery to tuck thee snugly up." And the young girl, laughing like a brook in springtime, went on and left me there discomfited. Nevertheless, I went down and took the plain but wholesome breakfast that they offered me, and afterwards whiled away an hour or so upon the bench in wondering silently what all this meant, where it was drifting to, how it would end, whether it were, indeed, ending or beginning. And then came round the girl again, and, railing me on my melancholy, took me out to see the herds and fields, and was all the time so sweetly insolent after her nature, and yet so velvet soft that I was fairly glamoured by her. This maid with the quick woman tongue that was so pointed and could at need hurt so much, and the blue speaking eyes that were as tender and straightforward as her speech was full of covert thorns, led me out into the orchards. First she took me to where the milk was stored, a roomy open shed, smelling of cool cleanliness, with white benches down the sides and red flagged floor, and great open pans of crimson were full of frothy milk. Outside the low straw eaves the swallows were chattering, while the emerald meadows, through the farther doorway, glistened and gleamed in the bright spring sunshine. Here we discovered two country girls at work, making curds and cheese and butter, ruddy buxom damsels, with strong round arms bare to the shoulder, with rattling clogs upon their feet, white gowns tucked up, and kerchiefs on their heads. These curtsied as we entered, and rattled the pans about, and sent the strong streams of warm new milk gushing from pail to pan. And then presently, when I had watched a time their busy labour, nothing would suit Mistress Faulkner but I should try. That saucy laughing girl would have it so, and, glancing at the delighted milkmaids, dragged me to a churn, there bidding me to roll a sleeve to my elbow and take the long handle thus and thus, and put my strength into it, and show I could do something to earn a luncheon. And I, ever strong and willing, did her bidding, and rolled back my silk and lawn, and bared the thews that had made me dreadful and victorious in 1,000 combats, and seized that white straight rod. But hoth! 'Twas not my trade. I had more strength than art, and the first stroke that I made upon the curdling stuff within the white fluid leapt in a glittering fountain to the roof above, and drenched the screaming maidens. The second stroke from my stalwart shoulders started 2 iron hoops binding the strong ash ribs of that churn, and made it swirl upon the tiles, while at the third mighty fall the rammer was shivered to the grasp, and the milk escaped and went in 20 meandering rivulets across the floor. At this uprose those fair confederates and drove me forth with boisterous anger, saying I had wasted more value in good milk than most likely all my life so far had earned. While they put right my amiss, I sat upon a mossy wall and wiped dry my hose and doublet. Nor was there long to sit before out came my comely hostess with forgiveness in her smiling eyes. " Did I now see," she queried, " how presumptuous it was to meddle with such things as were beyond one's capacity?" To which I answered that I truly saw. " And did I crave forgiveness, would I make amends?" And to that I said that she had but to try me in some venture where my rough unruly strength might tell, and she should see. So peace was made between us, and on we went again to note how the crimson buds were setting on the sunny red garden walls, to explore her sloping orchards and count the frolic lambs that clustered round the distant folds. It was her kingdom, and here her knowledge bettered mine. This she soon found out, and when I showed at fault in the stratagems of husbandry, or tripped in politics of herds or flocks, she would glance at me through her half-shut lids, and demurely ask, " Are you of good learning, friend?" And to that I answered that I had so much as might be picked up in a reasonably long life, not scholarly or well polished, but sufficient and readily accessible. " I am glad of it," she said. " Then you can tell the difference between a codling and a pippin?" " Nay, I fear I cannot." " Oh, nor why one hen will lay white eggs and another brown?" " Sweet maid, my wonder never went as far as that." " I do greatly doubt you and your wonder. What would you do if butter would not come upon the churn milk?" " Faith, I would leave it as not worth asking for. A poor white laggard stuff no man should meddle with." "Heigh ho! And what is rosemary good for, and what rue?" "By heaven, I do not know." "How soon mayst wean a February lamb, and what wouldst thou wean it on?" "Oath, I cannot tell." "Nor when to cut meadow grass or make ketchup, nor how to cure bee stings or where to look for saffron, nor when to plant green barley or pull rushes for winter candles?" "Not one of these. But if you would show me, such a tutor such a pupil never would have had." Whereon the lady burst out laughing. 'Oh,' she said, 'you are shallow and ignorant past all conception and precedent. Why, the rosiest urchin that ever went afield upon a plough horse has better stock of learning. I' faith, I shall have to put you to school at the very beginning.' I let the fair maid mock, for her gentle raillery was all upon her lips, and in her eyes was dawning a light it moved me much to see. We wandered away through pleasant copses, where the yellow catkins and the red were out upon the hazels, and late ivory blackthorn buds, like webs of pearls, were overhung upon those ebony fingered bushes, and fair pale primroses shone in starry carpets under the fresh green canopy of the new tented woods. And my fair Bess knew where the mavis built, and when I began to speak warm and close into her ear she would turn away her head and laugh, and, to change the matter, play traitor to the little birds and point their mossy home, and make me stoop and peer under the leaves and in pretty excitement. But was it all absent-mindedly? Would lay a hand upon my own and be cheek to me for a moment, and then, with country pleasure, take the sapphire shells of future woodland singers in her rosy palm, and count and con them, and post me in the lore of spots and specks and hues and colours, and all the fair incomprehensible alchemy of nature, then put those tender things back and lead on again to more. Pleasant is the sunshine in such circumstances. Fair Elizabeth knew all the flowers by name. She knew where the gorgeous celandine, like bright blazoned heralds of the spring, was flashing down by the stream that ran sparkling through the woods. The underglow upon the frail anemone was not fairer than her English skin, as she did bind a bunch into her bosom knot. She could tell the reasons of affinity tween cuckoo pint and cuckoo, and how it was that orchid leaves came spotted, and the virtue of the blue-eyed pimpernels, and why the gently rasping tongues of the great meadow kine forswore the nodding clumps of buttercup. And she liked cowslips, and made me pick them. Ah, swarthy, strong, and sad-eyed me with the wild alarums of battle still ringing in the ambient country air, me to whose eyes the fleecy clouds, even as she babbled, were full of pictures of purple ambition, of red mêlée, of the sweeping yellow war dust that canopies contending hosts, me who heard on every sigh of the valley wind the shouting of princes and paladins, the fierce deep cry of captains, and the struggling cheer that breaks from swinging ranks fast locked in deadly conflict as the foemen give. But nothing she knew of that, and would lead from cowslip banks back to coppice, and from coppice path to orchard, and there, mayhap, in the eye of the sun, secure from interruption, we would sit, she meetly throned upon the great stem of a fallen apple-tree, whose rind was tapestried betimes for that dear country sovereign by green moss and tissued gold and silver lichens, and overhead the leaves, and at her feet the velvet cushions of the turf, and me a solitary courtier there. A very pleasant wooing, and if you call me fickle, why should I argue it? Think of the vast years that lapse between my lovings. Think how solitary was the lovely loveless world I was born into anew each time. Think how I longed to light it with the comradeship that shines in dear eyes and hearts. How I thirsted to prejudice some sweet stranger to my favour amongst all others, and claim again kinship of passion for a moment with one at least of those dear fickle mocking shadows that glance through this fitful dream of mine. Besides, I was young, only some trivial 1500 years or so had gone by since they first swaddled me and dried my mother's tears. My limbs were full and round, my blood beat thick and fast, youth and soldier spirit shone in my undimmed eyes, not a strand of silver glanced in that beard I peaked so carefully, and, if my mind was full of ancient fancies, crowded with the dust and glitter of bygone ages fuller than yonder old fellow's strange museum, why, my heart was fresh. Jove, I think it was as young as it had ever been, and that maid was fair and rosy and kind and tender. All in the glow of her hat brim, her face shone like the ripe side of a peach, her smooth hands hung down convenient to my touch, and her head, crowned with its sweet crown of sunlit hair, was ever bent indulgent to catch my courtier whispers. What, I argued, shall the river play with no more blossoms because last year its envious fingers shook some petals down into its depth? Must the lonely hill for ever frown in solitude, and put by the white mist clinging arms, because, forsooth, some other earlier cloud once harboured on its rugged bosom? 'Twas miserly and monstrous, said my youthfulness. So, nothing forgetting and nothing diminishing of those memories that I had, I plunged into the new. And that kind country girl played Phyllis to my new tried Corydon as prettily as anyone could wish. I will not weary you with all we did or said. The murmur of a summer brook is only good to go to sleep by, but picture us immersed in solitary conclave, or wandering about in the sweet green math of April meadows, and finding the long days some 6 hours all too short to say the nothing that we had to do. Suppose this written, and I turn to other scenes which perhaps shall amuse you better. It by no means followed that because Mistress Elizabeth proved so charming her father was neglected. That old fellow had taken me for his helper, had fed and harboured me, and something seemed owing him in return. His huge and bulky engine was growing apace, indeed, it was just upon the finishing. It was that my strong arms might second him in some final parts he had brought me hither, and, being by nature something of a smith, I helped him readily. Each day was spent in the sunshine and flowers. Then, when evening came and my fair playmate was gone to bed, I descended into old Faulkner's crypt, and adding one more character to the many already played, turned Vulcan. Hard and long we worked. Had you looked upon us, you would have seen by the sullen furnace glow 2 men, bare armed and leather aproned, toiling in that black gallery until the sweat ran trickling from them, forging, riveting, and hammering bars of iron, plying the creaking bellows until the white heart of the fire heap was whiter than a glow-worm lamp, hurrying here and there about that glistening mountain of cunning fashioned steel that they were building, filling their grimy den with flying dust and smoke and sparks, and thus working on and on through the long midnight hours as though their very lives depended on it, until the black curtain of the night outside faded to pallid blue, and the chirrup of the homing bats coming to sleep upon the rafters sounded pleasantly, and the furnace gave out, and tired muscles flagged, and the night's work was over with the night. Evening after evening we toiled upon the iron giant that was to do such wondrous things, old Faulkner directing, and I supplying with my thews and sinews the help he needed. Then one day it was finished in every point and part, complete, gigantic, wonderful. I do confess something of the old man's spirit entered into me when our work was thus accomplished. I stood minute by minute before it, overcome with an awe and wonder inexplicable, and if the 'prentice felt like that, the master was mad with expectation and delight. Nothing now would do but he must try it, and the next night we did so. We sent the household early to their rest, and, as soon as it was dark, I, carrying a spluttering torch, and Faulkner the great cellar key, stole like thieves across the cobbled courtyard to our workshop. The scholar's fingers trembled till he scarce could fit the key into the wards, but presently the door was opened and we entered. " No strangers trespass here to night," the old man chuckled, while he closed and double locked the iron-studded door, and put the key into his belt, and the torch into a socket. Well, all agog with excitement, we lit the fires in the iron stomach of that finished monster, we filled his gullet with kegs of water, slewed his guiding wheels round, laid heavy sloping oaken planks for his highness to leave his birthplace by, set back the litter, and lastly turned the tap that brought the fire and water together, and put the blood of that iron beast in motion. He came down from off the pedestal for all the world like some black gorgon issuing from a den. Resplendent in weight and strength, he came sliding down from off the platform of his cradle, and amid the crash of struts and stays, amid flying splinters and the dust of transit, rolled out majestic into the red furnace light, where, trembling in every fibre, and gently swaying like a young giant feeling his strength for the first time, with the strong breath within murmuring and the great steel heart pulsating audibly, our iron toy was born and launched, and came forth, magnificent, huge, overpowering, then, checked by its anchor chains, swerving round to face the farther end, and halted. Old Faulkner was possessed with joy, dancing and capering round that huge carcass as though he were a 10 years' urchin, his white beard all astream, his elfin locks shaggy on his head, his black venerable robes flapping like the wings of a great bat, his hands clasped fervidly as he leapt and skipped with pleasure, and his lips moving rapidly as he babbled incoherent adulation and love upon that firstling of his hopes. Even I, grave and thoughtful, was elated, and walked round and round the wondrous thing, patting its iron sides as one might a charger's just led from a stall, while, half in wonder and half in pleasure, catching a fraction of the old man's fancies. So far everything had happened as we wished for, and Faulkner, when he could get his breath, burst out in wild rhapsodies of all his bantling should do, and I put in a sentence here and there amid his paeans. And then he capped on a hope, and I again a fancy, and so, nodding and laughing to each other, we bandied words across that carcass for 20 minutes, and felt its sinews and marvelled at its tractableness and grace. And what was our sweet Cheops doing all that while? Oh, we were young in mechanics, and all the time we talked and capered the glowing fires were working in that body, and presently the wheels began to ramble and the bars to move. Strange dull thunder came fitfully from under those steel ribs, and quaint unaccountable knockings sounded deep within. The furnace glowed white and hot as angry jets of steam commenced to spit from every weak point in the monster's harness. All this I noticed and pointed out to the master, but he was stupid with gratification in that moment of consummated labour, and now our vast machine began to fret. It was impatient, I saw with a presage of coming evil, and the great circles above began to grit their iron teeth and spin like distaff wheels under a busy housewife's hand. The pistons were shooting to and fro faster and ever faster, while that 50 tons of metal, glowing hot, now began to yank hungrily upon its chains, and start forward a foot and then come back, and sniff and snort and tremble, and strain in every part, and thunder and pant as the hot life surged stronger and stronger into its veins, until it was rocking like a skiff at anchor, and bellowing like a bull in agony. ' By every saint, old Adam Faulkner !' I shouted through the gathering roar, ' by every saint in paradise, have a care for this frightful beast of thine !' And I think he saw at last our danger, for the 100th rhapsody died unfinished upon his lips, and, dropping from the clouds at once with an anxious look, he scanned the now flying wonders of his offspring, and then ran round and seized the handle which should have shut off the red-hot vapour which was the breath and being of the puissant thing he had conjured into being. Twice and thrice he bore upon that handle, then turned to me with a wild and frightened look. 'Twas as hot could be, and could not move an inch. Hardly had I read that in his face when, with an angry plunge, the engine started forward, and the philosopher missed his footing, rolling over headlong to the ground at my feet, and now our beast was mad with waiting, and stronger than 50 elephants, and fiercer than the netted lion. The chains that held him upon either side were as thick as a man's arm, being fastened to mighty staples in the forge. Our swaddling came back 2 yards upon those chains, then started forward, and was brought up all on a sudden with such a jerk as made the ground tremble, and filled us with a sickly dread. Back came our splendid plaything again in no good mood, and then forward once more, putting his mighty shoulders against his bonds until the great steel chains stretched and groaned beneath the strain. And Adam Faulkener yelled in fear. The third time the monster did this the staples gave, and all the forge fell into one dusty smoking ruin, while the great engine twirled up those heavy chains upon its thundering axles, and, laughing in savage joyfulness, recognised the fatal fact that it was free. Then began a wild scene of chaos which brings the dampness of fear and exertion on my forehead even to remember. What mattered chains or bars or fetters to that splendid life that we could hear humming there under those iron ribs, to that unruly devil heart which knew its strength and thundered in proud tumultuous rhythm to the consciousness? The wonderful new Titan was born, and there, in his own den, in the black cradle of his nativity, would brook no master. He was born for strength and might, and, Hoth, they were running hot within him, and we could but cower in the shadows waiting and watching. And now that hideous monster, being free to do what he listed, set off for the far end of the stony cellar, and, like a great black ship floundering in a chopping sea, went plunging and reeling over the uneven floor. We held our breath. What would he do when he reached the end? And in a minute he was there, and through the gloom we heard him crash into the rocky walls and recoil, then, with a scream like an angry devil baby, charge the native masonry again and again. But Faulkener's wretched cunning had put the guiding wheels on pivots, and now they slewed, and here he was, coming down the walls towards us. We did not stop or wait to parley. We ran and dodged behind the pillars, whence we heard him thud into the broken forge. Aye, through the reek and cloudy steam we caught the sound of that 50 tons of metal clambering over the fallen masonry, all the time screeching in his anger like a peevish fury at being so thwarted. Then back we dodged again, and the huge thing went lumbering by us, full of a horrid giant life no valour availed against, no mortal hands could shackle. The more he beat about the bounds of that narrow infernal kingdom, the less our Cyclops seemed to like it. His rage mounted at each turn he made, and found his prison cell so narrow, and every rebuff swelled his budding choler. Therefore, seeing how hopeless it was to strive to tame him in this present mood, I waited till Cyclops was exploring at the bottom of the hall, then, plunging through the dusty turmoil, found old Faulkener. That grey inventor was reeling like a drunken man, and witless with terror. ' The key, the key !' I shouted in his ear. ' To the door ! We can do no good here. Let your infernal beast burn out some of his accursed spleen, then we'll make a shift to tame him. But 'tis no good now. Hear how he thunders, and see, he is coming back again.' ' Ay, the door, good friend, the door !' gasped Faulkener, and, clinging to my arm, hotly pursued by the monster behind, whose red-hot madness now seemed tinged with cruel purpose, we fled down the long black cavern to the iron-studded postern. There was not a second to spare. The old man plunged his trembling hands into his belt and felt all round it, then turned to me with a horrid stare in his eyes and a sickly smile upon his thin white lips. The key was gone. I dragged that old man back just as the great engine, ramping hot, lurched down and cut a long smoking groove half a foot deep from the rocky wall whereby we had been standing, then, disappointed of us, went howling on into the blackness. And now there was nothing to do but to stay and fight it out, no exit for us, and none for our sweet bantling, and he seemed to know it. Round and round he drove us through the flickering gloom and shadows of that dismal cockpit, till the gushing sweat ran from us, and our choking breath came short and panting through our parching throats. Oh, it was a sight to see that shrieking monster, spurting steam at every joint and howling like a pack of winter wolves, come careering through the darkness at us, with every plate of his mighty harness quivering with the force within, and all his thundering vitals glowing white and spawning golden trails of molten embers as he lurched along. Down I would see him come, perhaps hunting something in a savage mood, and as I dodged behind a pillar and looked, out of the vortex of the shadows would leap old Adam Faulkener, as a leveret leaps from the ferns under a lurcher's nose, and, with ashy wild face and flying wizard locks and ragged sorrel cloak flapping in shreds behind him, the master would flash in frenzied fear across the glow that shimmered from the heart of his young Titan, and then be swallowed up again by the next friendly blackness, and I scarce dare breathe, as, with a hideous parody of vindictive cunning, that great thing would swirl and swerve and be after him again. It was a wild, wonderful game, and the longer it went the hotter it grew. Closer, denser, and blacker grew the gloom of that place, until at length you could not see an arm's stretch ahead of you in the sulphurous reek, a hot steamy pall of dismal vapour, through which glimmered redly now and then the ashes of the overturned furnace place, and the rosin dripping splutter of the feeble torch which we had put into the socket by the door. Ah, that was all we had to light us as we crawled and leapt and dodged before the vengeful fury of that screaming harpy of ours, all but his own red copper glow that flamed now here, now there on the black horizon of our den. Darker and still darker and hotter became the air, until at last, in half an hour perhaps, the torch and the furnace ashes were sickly stars, too pallid to light our merriment to any purpose, and even the glow of Faulkener's great invention was a red-hot haze, only illumining the seething dust and smoke a yard or two about it, and everywhere else reigned black, choking, Stygian, infernal darkness. A blank midnight void hung about the arena where we danced to that great being, sprung like a black Minerva from my master's over-fertile brain. Yet, Jove! 'Twas midnight dark, but there was no midnight stillness in it. The very air seemed palpitating to the thunderous beat of that beast's mighty life. Every hollow cavern niche in our rocky walls bellowed into our startled ears a hideous mockery of his screeching, while the ceaseless roar of his cruel stride rattled down the ragged juts of our stony roof like dislocated thunder. And in that darkness and ear-splitting din we dodged and dipped and scuttled like two cornered rats. I have been brave — by this time I hope you will know it — but what was mortal strength or valour against the strength and recklessness of that iron god? No, he had the upper hand and screamed for blood like the devil that he was, pressing us with such fury that my very soul seemed oozing through my sweating skin. As for dignity, gods, I had none. At one moment I and Faulkener would be struggling for a narrow passage like two hoggets in a meadow gate. Then I was anon crawling on hands and satin knees through pools half a foot deep with filthy furnace water, or straddling greasy heaps of brash and ashes with the beast close behind to fire my flagging spirits, spurting flame and scalding steam and crunching with his ponderous weight through the iron litter of the den as though it were an august stubble. And this was not all. Being so dark as I have said, presently that iron monster, inspirited with the soul of a fury, found it more and more difficult to follow us, and went reeling and bellowing through the steamy blackness ever more at random. Thereon he stopped a spell and seemed to listen, and though we could only tell his whereabouts by the great fiery nebulae of his glowing sides, we could plainly hear his thousand steel teeth champing, and the gush of the boiling force flying within him. We held our breath, and then we heard something change in the machinery, some pin or rivet fail, and the next minute Faulkener's baby was off again with a scream like a lost spirit and possessed of a cursed brand new idea. I have said the chains wherewith he had been held to the forge were fastened to great revolving bars upon his side. When he burst free he had torn these from the solid masonry and wound them up upon the spinning axles, whereto, by some misguided cunning, Faulkener had welded them, And now that devil was ramping round to find us in the void, and had unwound those hideous flails, and with infernal patience was beating down one wall and up the other. Oh, it was sickly to hear the screech of those steel whips sweeping unseen through the startled air, to hear them thud upon the trembling ground, and cut deep furrows in it at every savage lash, now here, now there, flogging the frightened shadows and scourging the trembling rocks, and whistling overhead like 1,000 winged snakes, and all for us, while that great babe of my master's hunted slowly round about our narrow prison, and thundered and howled and rattled like a tempest in a mountain pass, and as though he were some great monster in a deep sea cave, shot out and drew in those humming tentacles, and tried each nook and corner, and squirted steam and fire into every crevice, and plied his cruel whips madly about in that darkness till 'twas all like pandemonium. Well, I will say no more, or you may think I wrap sober fact in that mantle of fancy which the gods have lent me. We had dodged and ducked at this game for many minutes when Faulkener's mind gave way. I chanced upon him in the middle space, laughing and screaming and taking off his cloak and vest. He saw me stalk from the shadows, and, with a frightful grin and caper, shouted that he knew what was the matter. His pretty firstling needed a bloody sacrifice, and who could provide it better than himself? Just then the engine turned and came looming through the mist towards us, and the old enthusiast made ready to cast himself under those mighty wheels. ' Come back !' I shouted. ' Come back !' But Faulkener yelled, ' Touch me at your peril ! The sweet one must not be baulked !' and made towards it. I seized him by the arm and dragged him to one side, whereat, without further parley, like a furious wild cat, he turned and in a twinkling had me by the throat, with those old talons of his deep buried in my gullet, and his long lean legs twirled round mine like thongs of leather, and his mad eyes flashing, his white face lit up with maniac passion. And so we heaved and struggled, then down upon our knees and over upon the floor, the old man striving all he knew to kill me, while I, for my part, heaved and wrenched, all my splendid strength cramped up in the wild grip of that sinewy old recluse, and over us, as we fought upon the earth, was glimmering in a minute the red copper glow, the towering form, and the cruel shrieking flails of that exulting demon we had invented. We rolled and plunged in the dust just where that circle of red light fell on it, while guttural sobs and sighs came from us as, forgetful of all else, now one was on top in that ruddy arena and then the other. The veins were big upon my forehead. I felt faint and sick. I could not loosen Faulkener's iron fingers, deep bedded in my neck, and did not care. And that grim old fellow had no desire now but to watch me die. I saw the glowing haze wherein we fought, and dimly understood it. I heard, faintly and more faintly, the rattle of the chains and the thunderous black laughter of our plaything, and then, just as that glowing fury seemed drawing itself together for one final effort which should crush us both from all form and shape, that very effort put something out of gear. The tangled wheels fell into the deadlock all on a sudden. The heavy chains jerked wildly in their swing and twisted together. The mighty rods and pistons went all asplay like a handful of broken straws. The great beast trembled and reeled and shook, and then split open from end to end, and, with a thunderous roar that shook our cellar to its deepest foundations, amid a wild gust of flame and steam, blew up. I rose unhurt from the dust and ashes, and, unwinding Faulkener's lifeless limbs from about me, found a hammer by the forge, and, scrambling over the now pulseless remnants of the giant, burst open the door, and a few minutes later laid the great inventor's body down upon a bench in the peaceful moonlit courtyard. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician, by Edwin Lester Arnold. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The episodes I now relate are so strange, so nearly impossible, that I hesitate to set them down, lest you should call me untruthful and a jongleur. Nevertheless, they are told as they occurred, and you must believe them as you may. My quaint recluse had not been slain that night we tried his infernal engine, but had laid in a long swoon after I carried him from amid the wreck and debris of his den out into the moonlight. That swoon, indeed, lasted for a whole day and night, and Elizabeth wrung her white hands over her father's seeming lifeless body, while Emmanuel picked his yellow teeth reflectively with his dagger point at the couch foot, and Dame Margery spent all her art in unguents and salves upon the luckless inventor ere he showed signs of returning life. At last, however, he revived, and made a long slow recovery of many days under the gentle ministering of his women, and while he throve hour by hour in the spring sunshine on the bench of his porch, I wooed his daughter in wayward, dissatisfied kind, and laughed scornfully at the black Spaniard's jealous scowls, and won the mellow heart of the old dame by my gallantness and courtesy. But it was child's play. I longed again to feel the hot pulse of keen emotions throbbing in my veins, to struggle with some strong tide of hot adventure, and so at last I had made up my mind to leave my good host and hostess at an early season, and, turning soldier again, espouse the first quarrel which chance threw in my way. Then one day it happened, a strange day indeed to me. Old Master Adam Faulkener had grown weary of his cranks and fan wheels, and had gone for solace to his dusty tomes and classics. Exploring amid them, in an eventful moment he had taken down a missal penned by some old Saxon monk, and turned to a passage he must have known well, since it was marked and thumbed, and while the ancient scholar read and mumbled over that quaint black letter with its gorgeous gold and crimson uncials, I, who chanced to stand a little way apart, saw the wan blood mount in a thin pink glow to the enthusiast's cheeks, and in that flush recognised that he was warm upon another quest. He mumbled and muttered to himself, and while he sauntered up and down, or stopped now and then to thumb and pore over that leathern volume, I caught, in disjointed fragments, some pieces of his thoughts. ' Ha, ha ! A most likely find indeed, a splendid treasure house of trophies, and to think that no one but old Ambrose and I wot of it. Oh ! What does he say ? And in this place was destroyed a noble house, and the anger of the Lord fell on the pagan defenders, and they were slain one and all. Ah ! God levelled their idolatrous dwelling places, and scattered their ashes to the four winds of heaven, and with them were destroyed, the common legend saith, all their hoards of brass and silver, all their accursed images of bronze and gold, all their trinkets and fine raiment, so that the vengeance of the Lord was complete, and the heathen was utterly wiped out. Good, very good, brother Ambrose,' muttered the old man with chuckling pleasure. ' And now, where did this thing happen ? This house, which harboured so much lewdness, stood on the hillock by the road, a few miles from the river, and had all that land which now is wholly perquisite to the neighbouring abbey. Good, good, for certain 'tis the very spot I thought of. A happy, happy chance that made me light upon this passage. I, who live so near the spot it speaks of. I, who alone of 1,000 can use it as the golden key to unlock such a sweet mine of relics as that buried pagan home must be. Oh, Ambrose, I am grateful.' And patting the musty monkish tome in childish pleasure, he replaced it reverently upon its shelf. Then up and down he paced, the student's passion burning hot within him, muttering as he went, ' Why not to night ? Why not ? Why not ? There is no season better for such a work than soon, and I have my licence,' whereon he went to a peg on the wall and fumbled in the wallet of the ragged cloak I had seen him wear the night we met. In a minute out came a brand new scroll of parchment, neatly rolled and folded and stamped with the royal seal. That scroll Adam Faulkener undid, and, setting his horn glasses on his nose, began to read the paper at arm's length with inarticulate sounds of rapture. It seemed to delight him so much that presently I sauntered over to share in the merriment, forgetting I had thus far been unobserved. But when we came within 2 paces of each other, the scholar, perceiving me with a cry of dismay, stuffed the crushed parchment hurriedly into his bosom, as though he thought himself about to be robbed of something precious by a sudden ambuscade. However, in a minute he recognised the robber and was reassured, yet undecided still, and inch by inch the white roll came forth, while the old man kept his eyes fixed on mine. What were his scrips and scrolls to me? I smiled to note the store he set by them. There was not one of those poor things could interest me more nearly than a last year's leaf from the garden yonder, and yet, strange to say, that white roll, creeping into light from under his rusty gaberdine, did attract me somehow. Long life and strange experience have wakened in me senses dormant in other mortals, and I begin to be conscious of a knowledge beyond common knowing, a sense behind other senses, which grows with practice and seems ambitious by and by to bridge the gulf which separates tangible from unreal, and what is from what will be. That growing perspicacity within me smelt something of weight about Faulkener's writing more than usual, and with my curiosity gently roused, I queried, ' That seems a scrip of value, sir. Is its interest particular or public ?'' In some ways, good youth,' Faulkener answered hesitatingly, as he unfolded the scroll so slowly as though he were jealous even of the prying sunshine, ' in some ways the interest of what this is the key to is very general, and in other ways it is, at least for some time to come, most private.' ' Enough,' I said, ' and I am sorry to have questioned you, but your pleasure in the tome over there suggested just now that this was some general matter of curiosity, some dark passage in history whereon, perhaps, 2 minds might shed more light than one. I ask indulgence for intrusion.' ' Nay, but stop a minute. History, did you say? Why, this is history. This is the birth scrip of a brand new page in history. This is leave to turn a leaf no other fingers have ever turned, to spell out in sweet ashes and lovely fragments a whole chapter, perchance, of the bygone. Boy,' cried the old fellow, grasping my arm with his lean fingers, and whispering in my ear as though he dreaded the grinning mummy of Pharaoh in the shadow might play eavesdropper, ' can you keep a secret ?'' Ay, fairly, when it does not interest me.' ' Why, then, there, take that and read it.' And Faulkener thrust the roll into my hands, and cast himself into an attitude, and crossed his arms upon his chest, and stared at me from under his shaggy eyebrows, as if he fancied to see fear and wonder and delight fly over my countenance while my eyes devoured that precious deed of his. What was there so wonderful in it? The thing was sealed and tasselled, the ink and paper were new, the parchment white. It was, in fact, the very vellum Faulkener had been on his way to beg at court when we 2 met. A wonderful chance, as you shall presently see, an extraordinary hap indeed, that brought me to his side out of the great wastes of time at the very instant when that ancient scholar was on the road to ask that licence. But I did not know while I read how nearly the parchment touched me. It looked just like an ordinary missive from high authority to humble petitioner, profuse and verbose, signed and countersigned, and amid a wilderness of words just a grain of sense that I construed as giving the bearer leave to seek for treasure on certain lands therein mentioned, and adopt the same to his proper pleasure without tax or drawback. ' This may be a golden key, sir,' was my response as the thing was handed back, ' but it is difficult to learn anything of the door it opens by looking on it.' ' Yet, nevertheless, young man, it is a golden key, and you shall see me use it, for if, as yonder broken engine hints, the Fates will that I may not pry into the misty future, yet, with their leave, with the help of this and you, will I peep into the even more shadowy past. Were you ever at the opening of an ancient crypt, a stony hiding place, for instance, where dead men's bones lay all about mid dim gems and the rusty iron playthings of love and war ?'' I do recall one such an episode.' ' And did it not affect you greatly ?'' Greatly, indeed.' ' Ay, boy, and this that I will show you shall affect you more. We two will turn a leaf which shall read as clear to you as though you had been at the writing of it 1,000 years before. It is a grassy hillock, and you shall lift that sod with me, and if this thing is as I think it is, oh, you shall start at what you find, and coward ague shall unstring your soldier legs. You shall be dumb with wonder, and ply your mattock with damp fearful awe beaded on your forehead, and starting eyes fixed fast in horrid pleasure on what we will unearth. Ay, if you have a spark of generous comprehension, if one drop of the milk of kindness still bides within you, you shall people this place we go to find with such teeming sprightly fancies, such moving mockeries of frail humankind new risen from their ashes at your feet, that you shall wring your hands out of pure rue for them that were, and pluck your beard in dumb chagrin, and beat upon your heart even to watch all that which once was ruddy valour and hot love and white beauty go a-drifting so upon the dusty evening wind. You will come with me ?'' Old man,' I said, pacing up and down with folded arms and bent head, ' 'twas upon my tongue to say I would not. I had a fair tryst to keep this evening, and something that I have seen of late makes such ventures as you have planned doubly distasteful to me. 'Twas in my mind to laugh and shake my head, but, gods ! you have stirred a pulse within me that rouses me with resistless wonder. Your words tell on me strangely. There is something in that you say which echoes through my heart like the footfall of a storm upon the hollow earth, and I can do nothing but listen and acquiesce. I will come.' ' Good youth, I knew you would. And that our hopes may not suffer by delay, let us prepare at once. Get you mattock, spade, and pick with whatever other tools your strength shall need, and I will feed and have my pretty palfrey saddled, and con yon crabbed passage over once again. So we will be ready, and at nightfall under the yellow stars will start upon a venture that you shall think on for many a day.' I bent my head, and we did as Faulkener suggested, but a strange unrest possessed me. When spade and mattock were hidden where we could take them up in secret, for we did not wish our enterprise too widely known, the time hung wondrously heavy on hand. All the tedious hours before sunset I was oppressed with an anxiety quaint and inexplicable, half wishing by turns I had not promised to join the mad old fellow in his moonlight quest, and then laughing my scruples down and becoming as restless for the start as before I had been reluctant. As for the scholar himself, the very shirt of Deianira possessed him, and his impatience shone behind his yellow wrinkled face like a candle inside a horn lantern. Somehow the hours wore through, however, and when the evening was come we set forth, Faulkener pale and eloquently raving from astride of that mean palfrey, whose sumpter pad was loaded with our tools on one side, and on the other a monster sack wherein to bring back all the treasure we were to rifle, and I on foot, leading that gentle beast, and thoughtful past proportion or reason. At first we pushed on at a brisk pace, by familiar roads, but after a time our path lay more to the eastward, the scholar said, and once off the broad white track leading to the nearest town, the road grew narrower and more narrow. On we went in silence, mile after mile, by rutty lanes where twittering bats flitted up and down the black arcades of overhanging bush and briar, by rushy flats where the water stood wan and dim in the uncertain light, now brushing by the heavy dew-laden branches of a woodman's path through deep thickets of oak and beech, and then following a winding sheep track over ling and gorse. So sombre was that way, and so few the signs of life, I wondered how the scholar kept even the direction, but he was a better pilot than he seemed, and while he ranted silently upon the sky and waved his hands in ghostly rhythm to his unspoken thoughts, I found from a chance word or two he was in some kind watching the stars, and leading us forward by their dim light towards that goal whereof he had got knowledge from his musty tomes. On we went through the still starry night, pacing along from black shadows to black shadows, and moonlight to silver moonlight, until it must have been within an hour or two of daybreaking, for under the purple pall of sky there was a long stream of pale light in the east. It was about that time, and the night shadows were strong and ebony, and the cold breath and deep hush of a coming morning hung over everything, when Faulkener first began to hesitate, and presently confessed that which he sought for should be somewhere here. But in the glimmer of the starlight he was uncertain whether it lay to right or left. We halted, and mounting on a hillock, peered all about us, but to little purpose, for the sombre night hid everything. The massed forest trees rose tier upon tier on every hand, like mountain ranges running on indefinite into the gloomy passes of the clouds, and the chance gleams of moonlight, lying white and still upon the dew-damp meadows, were so like great misty lakes and rivers it were difficult to say whether they were such or no. So back we scrambled once more, and unhitched our patient beast from the hazel whereto we had tied him, and plunged on again by dingle and sandy road and rough woodland path until we were hopelessly mazed, and there seemed nothing for it but to wait till daylight or go empty back. Yet, reluctant to do either, we held to it a little, hoping some chance might favour us. 'Twas past midnight. Not a crow of distant cock or yelp of village cur broke the dead stillness, and we were plodding down a turfy road when, on a sudden, our patient steed threw forward his ears and came to a dead stop, and, almost the same minute, the grey-clad figure of a countryman in long cape and hood, a wide slouch hat upon his head, and a tall staff in his hand, came out from the depth 100 yards ahead of us, and with slow measured gait and bent face walked down towards us. Old Faulkener was overjoyed. Here was one who knew the country and would show us his precious hillock, and he shouted to that stranger and tugged his palfrey's rein. But that observant beast was strangely reluctant. He went on a pace, then stopped, and backed and pawed the silent ground, throwing his prick ears forward, whinnying and staring at that silent coming stranger with strange disquiet in every movement, and I sympathised with that dumb brute, and, as the countryman came near, somehow my blood ran cold and colder, my tongue, that was a wag to ask the way, stuck helpless to my teeth, a foolish chill beset my limbs, and by the time we met I had only wit enough left to stare speechless at that grey form in silent expectation. But the old philosopher did not feel these tremors. He was delighted at our good luck, and fumbling in his wallet pulled out a small silver piece, which he tendered to the man, explaining at the same time our need and asking him to guide us. The stranger took the coin in silence, and, keeping his face hidden in the shadow of his hat, said the mound was near. He knew it well, he had bided by it long, and he would willingly show us where it lay. Back we went by copse and heather, back for half a mile, then turned to the right, and in a few minutes more came out of the brushwood into the starlight, and there, at our very feet, the ground was swelling up in gentle sweep to the flat top of a little island hill lost in the sea of forest land about it. It was the place we came for, and the scholar, without another thought for us, joyfully pricked his steed to the rise, and was soon out of sight round the shoulder of the ground. But oh, what was that strange dull hesitation that made my feet heavy as lead upon that threshold? Whence came those thronging formless fancies that crowded to my mind as I surveyed that smoothly rounded hillock and all the fantastic shadows beyond it? That spot was the same one I had wandered to when I walked lonely from Faulkener's house, and here chance brought me to it anew at dead midnight, and all the old thrills of indistinct remembrance I then had felt were working in me again with redoubled force, moving my soul to such unrest that I bent my head and hid my eyes, and strove long, but vainly, to recall why or when I had last trodden that soil, as somewhere and somehow I was certain that I had. Thinking and thinking without purpose, presently I looked up, and there, 2 paces away, was still that grey hedgeman leaning on his staff and regarding me from under his country hat with calm, soulless attention. I had forgotten his presence, and it was so strange to see him there, so rustic and so stately, that I started back, and an unfamiliar chill beset me for an instant. But it was only a moment. Then, angry to have been surprised, I turned haughtily upon him, and with folded arms, in mockingness of his own stern attitude, stared proudly into those black shadows where should have been his face. Jove ! 'Twas a stare that would not have blanched for all the lightning in a Caesar's eye, or wavered one moment beneath the grim returning gaze of any tyrant that ever lived. And yet, even as I looked into that void, my soul turned to water, and my eyelids quivered and bent and drooped, my arms fell loose and nerveless to my side, and every power of free action forsook me. That being took my perturbation with the same cold lack of wonder he had shown throughout. He eyed me for a minute with his sleepy, stately calm, and then he said, ' You have been here before ?'' Yes,' I answered, ' but how or when only the great gods know ; and though I noticed it not at the moment, yet since it has flashed upon me as another link in a wondrous chain, that at that moment both I and the grey countryman were using the long forgotten British tongue.' ' And would you know, would you recall ?' he queried in his passionless voice. ' Ay, if it is within your power to stir my memory, stir it, in the name of loud Taranis, of old Belenus, and all the other fiends I once believed in.' ' Well sworn, Phoenician,' said that tall nocturnal wanderer, and without another word grasped his staff, and, signing me to follow, led round the shoulder of the hillock to where, alone and solitary, we two were stayed by a trickling rivulet that sprang from a grassy basin in the slope, and went by a little rushy course winding down into the dusty thickets beyond. At that pool my guide stopped suddenly, then, pointing with stern finger still shrouded under the folds of his ample cloak, ' Drink,' he cried, ' drink, and remember.' I could no more have thwarted him than I could have torn that solid mound from off its base, and down I went upon one knee, and took a broken crock some shepherd had left behind, and filled it and put it to my lips and drank. Then up I leapt with a wild yell of wonder and astonishment, while right across the sullen midnight sky, it seemed, there shot out in one broad living picture all the painted pageantry of my Roman life. I saw old Roman Britain rise before me, and the quaint templed towns of a splendid epoch leap into shape from the tumbled chaos of the evening clouds. I saw the crowded episodes that had followed after my rewakening in the cave where my Princess had laid me. The faces of my jolly long dead comrades seemed thronging round about me. I heard the street cries of a Roman British city. I saw the dust rise and the glitter, and the phalanges wheeled and turned upon the castra before the porch, where a gay patrician gallant I lounged in gold and turquoise armour. I saw Electra's ivory villa start into form and substance out of the pale, filtering Tudor moonlight, and the great white bull and the haughty lady, stately and tall, beckoning me up her marble steps, and then I was with her, her petted youth, lying indolent and happy, toying disdainfully with the imperial love she proffered me, while we filled our rainbow shells from that bright fountain that spurted in her inner court. With a wild cry I dropped the shepherd's crock and started back. The water I was sipping was the water of Electra's courtyard fountain. Gods ! There was none other like it. Often we two had drunk of that crystal torrent as it burst, full of those sweet earth salts the Romans loved so well, from the bowels of the earth straight into her pearly basins. The last time I had stooped to it was on that night of fiery combat when Electra's villa fell, and here I was sipping of it again so strangely and unexpectedly that I hid my eyes a space, scarce knowing what might happen next. When I uncovered them, the black dusky clouds had swallowed the painted pageantry of my vision, the night wind blew chill round the grassy slope, the Roman villa and fountain had gone from the grey shadows where we stood, only the tinkle of the falling water was left in the darkness, and in front of me still the tall figure of that grey clad countryman. Only that countryman. Hoth, how can I describe the rush of keen wonder and fear which swept over me when, looking at him again, I saw that he had turned back the flap of his wide hat, and there in the dead grey light was staring at me the same stern, passionless face that had come to my shoulder in the reek and heat of combat on this very spot 1300 years before, and, doing the bidding of the great unknown, had drawn me from those fiery shambles only just in time. I knew him then, on the instant, as no mortal, and glared at him with every nerve at tension, and speechless tongue, too numb to question, and while I stared like that, with the strong emotion playing on lip and eye, it was only a minute or so, though it seemed an epoch, the face of that being was lit by a smile, sedate and impalpable. Then, turning to me with gentle superiority, he said, " You have been long, Phoenician. They told me you would come again, and I have waited for you here these few hundred years, waited until I near tired of watching all your circling vagaries. Here is the place you came to-night to find. My errand ends. Dig, wonder, and reflect. This I was told to show you and to say." And like the echo of his own words, like the shadow of a cloud upon a rock, that strange messenger of another life was drunk up by the darkness right in front of my wondering eyes. So swift and silent was his passage back into the outer vagueness that for a minute I could not believe that he had gone in truth, and held my breath and stared up and down, expecting he would fashion again out of the draughty air, or speak above or below once more in that voice every syllable of which fell clear on my soul like water falling in a well. But it was useless to listen and peer into the gloom. The shape was gone beyond recall, and while my mind still pondered over the strangeness of it, keeping me spellbound at the brink of that enchanted fountain, with bent head and folded arms, trying to guess how much of this was fantasy and how much fact, there rose a shout upon the still night air, and, raising my eyes, there was Faulkener's quaint black image, capering wildly on the dusky skyline, the while he brandished aloft in one hand a spade, and in the other, looking quaintly like a new severed head dangling by the hair, the first sod he had cut of that treasure heap so dear and dreadful to me. I went sullenly up to the recluse, full of such strange conflicting feelings as you may suppose, and found him eager and excited. He had marked out a long furrow across the crest of the hill, and this we were to open and strike out right or left according as our venture throve. Jove! I stared for a time at that black trench as though it were the narrow lip of hell, which presently should yawn and throw up a grim, ghostly, warlike crew, worse than those who frightened Jason, and then I laughed in bitterness and perplexity, and tore off my doublet and rolled my tunic sleeves above my shoulder, and took a spade, and at one strong heave plunged it deep into the tender bosom of the swelling turf just over where the outskirts of the ancient Roman house had been, and wrenched it up. Then in again, then again, while the mad philosopher capered in the twilight to watch my sinewy strength so well applied, and the whistling bats swept curious round us. I had not turned back a stitch of that light peaty coverlet when down my spade sank through an inner crust, deep into something soft and hollow seeming, and the next minute Faulkener, who also had set to work, was in the same fine strata too. We laid it bare, and there below us shone, a floor of white dim ashes mixed with earth and leaves and roots. ' A torch ! A torch !' yelled Faulkener, and down he went upon his knees, and, wild with exultation, wallowed in that powdery stuff, throwing it out by hand and armfuls, till all his clothes were covered with it, and his hoary beard was still more hoary, and his white face still more white, and his mad twinkling eyes were still more lunatic, and I helping him, full of crowding hopes and fears. And so we dug and grovelled and scraped, while the pale stars twinkled overhead, until soon my master gave a shout, and, looking quickly at him, Jove, he was hand in hand with a dead white hand that he had uncovered, and was hauling at it in frantic eagerness, and scraping away the rubbish above, and slipping and plunging and staggering in the grey dust, while the beaded sweat shone upon his forehead, and his white elf locks were all astray upon the night air. And then, gods, it began to give, and I held my breath, knowing all I knew, while the white stuff cracked and heaved about that ghostly palm, and then it opened, and first his head, and then his shoulders, and then his stiff contorted limbs, my master dragged out into the starshine, with one strong effort, a bulky ancient warrior. There, in the torchlight which Faulkener held above him, slept that kiln-dried soldier. He lay flat upon his back, and while one knotted shrivelled fist was stretched stiff in front in deathless anger, the broken digits of his other hand were welded by red iron rust about the red rusty hilt of a bladeless sword, and that soldier's soulless face was set stiff and hard, while on his stern shut lips and deep in his eyeless sockets even now restless passion and quenchless hate seemed smouldering. About that frail body still clung in melancholy tatters the shreds and remnants of purple webs and golden tissue. On his shoulders, sunk into his withered lifeless flesh, were the mouldy straps and scales of harness and cuirass, and on his head what once had been, though now it was more like winter wrack, a gay helmet and a horseman's nodding crimson plume. It was a ghostly plaything to unearth like that under the wavering starlight, and it was doubly dreadful to note how deathlike was it, while yet all the hot life-passion lay stamped for ever in unchanging fierceness on the hideous mask of dissolution. I turned away as Faulkener, gleefully shouting that he was 1,000 years old if he was a day, tore the russet trophies from him and pushed him down the hill. I turned away, grimly frowning, out into the black starlight, with folded arms, for that contorted thing was jolly Caius Martius, my merry Byzantine captain of those mercenaries who stood it out with me that last night of Roman power in England. Jolly Caius Martius ! Often we two had set the British dogs a-yelping as we wandered home from noisy midnight frolics down the moonlit Temple streets. Often we two had driven the same boar to bay deep in his reedy stronghold. Often at banquet and at feast, when the roses lay deep below and the strong warm breath of scented wine hung thick above, that curly black head the Mercian damsels liked so well had sunk happy and heavy on my shoulder. Jove, how the world had spun since then, and there was Faulkener pushing him down the slope, and I could not raise a comrade finger for merry Caius, and could only stupidly remember, as the sprawling heap went trundling away into the brambles, how in that long ago I had owed him half a silver talent and had never yet repaid it. Well, we fell to work again, and farther on, amid the passages where these ancient men had fought and fallen in the rout, we found a limb, and dug about it till we uncovered another strange twisted hide of what was once humanity. A stalwart shell this one, but Faulkener thought little on him, because he wore no links or chains, and set him rolling after the other with scant ceremony. The next we came to seemed by gear and weapons a southern mercenary. He lay asprawl upon his face, and my master levered him out and plucked him of his scanty metal relics with no more compunction than if he were a pigeon. It was grim, wild work, there under the leer of the yellow dawning, all in the hush of the twilight, coming on those ghastly relics thus one by one, and prizing them out of their ashy shells, and turning them over, and reading on each black mummy mask, that seemed to smile and grin with dead ferocity under the flickering flambeau light, the countenance and fashion of ancient comrade and ally. And ever and anon as I worked, held to the labour by a strange fascination, the melancholy footfall of the gusty wind came pacing round the hill, and with a frown and start I would look over my shoulder, half fearing, half hoping it was my grey countryman come once more. So we toiled and toiled while the light waned, and Faulkner's treasure heap was swelling, and the nearer we worked to the centre of that ample round of corridors and courts, the thicker came to light those old world fighters, and presently we got right down to the tessellated paving of Electra's lordly hall, and here we found what it was which made all those ancient warriors so still and lasting. It was that strange, mysterious fountain, that jet of pungent taste and wondrous properties, when the walls fell in, had overflowed its basins and percolated through the deep soft ashes lying thick about these marble rooms and chambers, and by the stony magic wherewith it was charged had lined and filled those ancient gentlemen it met with, and thereafter, in long dark months of silence, had supplemented their wasting tissues with its calcareous sediment, and kept them for ever as we found them, strange, horrible, exact, and real, with passion and life stamped deep on every face, and strength and vigour in every limb, although those faces wore only ashy masks, and those limbs no stouter than the vellum on which I write. Under that crust of welded stone and ashes it was wonderful to see how perfectly was everything preserved. We raised it in great flakes from the stony flooring, and all the stain and litter of the fight lay under it as though they were not a dozen hours old. We chipped that scaly covering from the walls, and there, fresh as the moment they were made, gleamed up under our wavering torchlight all the gay mural paintings, the smudges of battle and the scars of axe and arrow. We lifted that pale stiff shroud from the inner chambers, and beneath lay shreds and shells of furniture and gear. The half-baked loaves were in the oven, the flesher's knife was on the block. Round about the bounds of that stately ruin we went, uncovering at every spadeful something mournful, forgetting fatigue and time as wonder after wonder rose to view. Thus we came at last to the mid-court where the great fight had been, and peeled the thin turf from off it, far and near. We had scarce begun to rake aside the ashes when down to help us came, out of the black parting clouds, strong gusts of cold morning wind, blowing fitfully at first and chill, and sobbing overhead, and all about us as though the grey air was full of spirits. It gathered strength, and, wailing over the wide floor we had uncovered, in one strong breath swept back the veil of ashes, and there, Jove, all amid the juts of fallen masonry and stumps of beam and rafter, blackened in that fire which seemed but yesterday, were high protruding knees of dead combatants, and stiff bent elbows as thick as grass, and haggard wizened faces all stamped with 20 fine degrees of terror, and fierce clenched fists, and hands that still waved above them broken hilt and blade. There they lay in heaps and rucks about that ancient villa floor, just as they had died fighting amid the red choking ashes of the blazing roof, all horribly lifelike and yet so grimly dead. Old Faulkner yelled in sheer affright and capered, and shook his fist towards them, and tore his lean white locks 'tween dread and wonder, and stiff my Phrygian curls seemed on my head, and cold the sweat upon my forehead. And then, while we watched, a very wonderful thing happened, and dreadful and beautiful, those cinders began to glow. Jutting beam and rafter grew red and redder, pile and timber and cornice caught the ambient blush, the crimson stain crept all across the hall, it burnt in mockery upon ruined wall and portico, and lit with an unearthly radiance those parched, contorted faces that grinned and leered and frowned, still in frantic struggle with their kind, all round us. Was I mad ? Was this some hideous last delusion which beset my aching mind and horror surfeited eyes ? No, there was Faulkener saw it too, and had fallen on his knees and buried his fearful face behind his hands, and thrown his gabardine cloak over his head to shut out that dreadful sight. I drew my hand across my face and looked again. It was true, too true, that charred and ancient villa was all alight once more. Wherever fire had been, at every point and crevice, there the ambient glow was smouldering with a flameless brightness. It underlay the silver ashes with a hot golden shine. It gilded all the fallen metal statues of gods and goddesses until they seemed to shimmer beneath its touch. It shone near by under the walls and far out upon the steps. It was so real, so terribly like what it had been here 1,000 years before, that I half bent to take a weapon in the delusion of that brilliant fantasy. A husky cry of encouragement to those stark ancient warriors half framed itself upon my lips, and then, how exactly I know not, but somehow a slight insequence flashed upon me, and in another minute I had spun angrily round upon my heel, and there I saw, right behind us, calm, benignant, crimson, the great May sun was topping the eastern oak trees. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician, by Edwin Lester Arnold. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After that eventful episode just detailed, life ran smooth and uneventful for a time in the old manor house. I had had enough to think of for many a day, and was inert and listless somehow. War, that had seemed so bright, had lost half its colour to me. Honour and renown — why, the green grass in the fields was not more fleeting, I began to think. And what use was it striving after conquests which another age undid, or attempting brave adventures whereof a later time recognised neither cause nor purpose? I was in a doleful mood, as you will see, and lay about on Faulkener's sunny red brick terraces for days together, reflecting in this idle fashion, or pressed my suit upon his daughter when other pastimes failed. Now this latter was a dangerous sport for one like me, and one whose fair opponent at the game had such a fine untaught instinct for it as Mistress Bess possessed. I began to speak soft things into that lady's ear, as you may remember, like many another, for lack of better occupation, and because it seemed so discourteous to be indifferent to the sweet enticement of my friend, and then I took the gentle malady from her, and, growing worse than she had been, how could she do aught but sympathise? And so, between us, we eked the matter on in ample leisure, until that which was a pretty jest became at last very serious and sober earnest. It was a strange wooing. I still worked in the forge, riveting, hammering, and piecing together the fragments of the scholar's shattered dream, and down the damsel would come at times into the grimy den, and sit upon the forge corner in her dainty country smock, twirling her ribboned points and laughing at me and my toil, as fresh and dainty among all that gloomy black litter round about as a ray of spring sunshine. I was so solitary and glum, how could I fail to be pleasured in that dear presence? And one time I would hammer her a gleaming buckle or wristlet out of a knob of ancient silver, and it was sweet to see that country damsel's eagerness, as, with flushed face and sparkling eyes, she bent over and watched the pretty toy shine and glitter and take form and shape under my cunning hammer. Or then again, perhaps, another day I would tell her, as though it were only hearsay, some wondrous old story of the ancient time, so full of light and colour and love as I could fill it, and that dear auditor would drink in every syllable with thirsty ears, and laugh and weep and fear and tremble just as I willed, the while I pointed my periods with my anvil irons, and danced my visionary puppets against the black shadows of that nether hall. Hoth ! A good listener is a sweet solace to him whose heart is full. Those narratives did so engross us that often the forge went cold, and bar and rivet slumbered into blackness, while I stalked up and down that dingy cavern, peopling it with such glowing forms and fancies as kept that dear untutored damsel spellbound. Often the evening fell upon us so, and we had at last to steal shamefacedly across the courtyard to where the warm glow behind the lattices told us supper and the others waited. There was small difference in these days. I hammered cheerful and I hammered dull, I hammered hopeful and I hammered melancholy. I hammered in tune to the merry prattle of that girl, and I hammered sad and solitary, and ever, as I forged and welded by myself, you may guess how I thought and speculated, thought of all the love that I had loved, and all the useless strife and ambition, and now hung over my blackening iron as the pain of ancient perplexities and disappointments beset me, and then anon laughed and beat new life into the glowing metal as the light of forgotten joys flashed for a moment on the fitful current of my mind. Ah, and again I forged hot and impetuous on my master's rods and rivets, as the old pulse of battles and onset swelled in my veins, forged and hammered while the stream of such fancies bore me on, until, unwitting, the very molten stuff beneath my hands took form and fashion of my thoughts, and grew up into shining spearheads and white blades, until the fantasy in turn was past, and I checked my fancies and saw, ashamed, the foolish work my busy hammer had fashioned, and sadly broke the spearheads and snapped the blades, and came back with a sigh to meaner things. My mind being thus full of all those wild adventures and wondrous exploits I had seen and shared, when, as I was strolling one idle morning down Faulkener's dusty museum corridor, and sampling as I went his precious tomes, that thing happened to which you owe this book. I dipped into his missals and vellums as I sauntered from shelf to shelf, and soon I found there was scarcely a page, scarcely a passage within their mothy leathern covers that did not touch me nearly, or set me thinking of something old and wonderful. There was not a page in all that fingered, scholar-marked library, it seemed to me, upon which I could not find something better or nearer to the shining truth to say than they who had wrote those cupboard histories and philosophies. And first I was only sad to see so much inaccurate set down, and then I fell to sighing as I turned the leaves of quaint treatise and pedantic monkish diary that they should write who knew so little, and I, who knew so much, should be so dumb. And thus vague fancies began to form within my mind, and, backed by the brooding memories strong within, began to egg me on to write myself. Jove ! I had not touched a pen for many hundred years, and yet here was the budding hunger for expression rising strong within me, and I laughed and went over to old Faulkener's great oak table by the mullioned window, and took up his quill and turned it here and there, and looked on both ends of it, then presently set it down with a shake of the head as a weapon past my wielding. I felt the texture of his vellums, and peered into the depth of his inkpot, as though there were to see therein all those glowing facts and fancies that I yearned to draw therefrom. But it would not do, not even the challenge of those piled tomes, not even the handy means to the end I coveted, could for a time break down my diffidence. So I fell melancholy again, and wandered down that quaintly stocked museum library, gazing ruefully on each sad remnant of humanity, and thinking how quaint it was that I should come to dust my kinsmen's skulls and tabulate those grim old heads that had so often wagged in praise of me, then back again to the shelves, and pored and pondered over the many authored books, until, by hap, my eyes lit upon a passage in an Eastern tale that was so pregnant with experience, so fine, it seemed to my mood in fancy and philosophy, that it entranced me and fired my zeal to a point naught else had done. The ancient Arabian narrator is telling how one came, in mid-desert, upon a splendid ruined city, a silent, unpeopled town of voiceless palaces and temples, and wandered on by empty street and fallen greatness, until, in the stateliest court of 1,000 stately palaces, he found an iron tablet, and on it was written these words: In the name of God, the Eternal, the Everlasting, throughout all ages. In the name of God, who begetteth not, and who is not begotten, and unto whom there is none like. In the name of God, the mighty and powerful. In the name of the living, who dieth not. O thou who arrivest at this place, be admonished by the misfortunes and calamities that thou beholdest, and be not deceived by the world and its beauty, and its falsity and calumny, and its fallacy and finery. For it is a flatterer, a cheat, a traitor. Its things are borrowed, and it will take the loan from the borrower, and it is like the confused visions of the sleeper and the dream of the dreamer. These are the characteristics of the world. Confide not, therefore, in it, nor incline to it, for it will betray him who dependeth upon it, and who in his affairs relieth upon it. Fall not into its snares, nor cling to its skirts, for I possessed 4,000 bay horses in a stable, and I married 1,000 damsels, all daughters of kings, high-bosomed virgins like moons. And I was blessed with 1,000 children, and I lived 1,000 years, happy in mind and heart. And I amassed riches, such as the kings of the earth were unable to procure, and I imagined that my enjoyments would continue without failure. But I was not aware when there alighted among us the terminator of delights, the separator of companions, the desolator of abodes, the ravager of inhabited mansions, the destroyer of the great and the small, and the infants and the children and the mothers. We had resided in this palace in security until the event decreed by the Lord of all creatures, the Lord of the heavens and the Lord of the earths, befell us, and the thunder of the manifest truth assailed us, and there died of us every day 2, till a great company of us had perished. So when I saw that destruction had entered our dwellings, and had alighted among us and drowned us in the sea of deaths, I summoned a writer and ordered him to write these verses and admonitions and lessons, and caused them to be engraved upon these doors and tablets and tombs. I had an army comprising 1,000 bridles, composed of hardy men with spears and coats of mail and sharp swords and strong arms, and I ordered them to clothe themselves with the long coats of mail, and to hang on the keen swords, and to place in rest the terrible lances, and mount the high-blooded horses. Then, when the event appointed by the Lord of all creatures, the Lord of the earth and the heavens, befell us, I said, O companies of troops and soldiers, can ye prevent that which hath befallen me from the mighty King? But the soldiers and troops were unable to do so, and they said, How shall we contend against him from whom none hath secluded the Lord of the door, that hath no doorkeeper? So I said, Bring to me the wealth. And it was contained in 1,000 pits, in each of which were 1,000 hundredweights of red gold, and in them were varieties of pearls and jewels, and there was the like quantity of white silver, with treasures such as the kings of the earth were unable to procure. And they did so, and when they had brought the wealth before me, I said to them, Can ye deliver me by means of all these riches? and purchase for me therewith one day during which I may remain alive.' But they could not do so. They resigned themselves to destiny, and I submitted to God with patient endurance of fate and affliction until He took my soul and made me to dwell in my grave. And if thou ask concerning my name, I am Kush, the son of Sheddad, the son of Ad the Greater.' ' Oh, well written !' I cried. ' Well written, Kush, the son of Sheddad, the son of Ad the Greater, well and wisely written, and also I will write, for I have much to tell, and I too may some day be as thou art.' Thus was the beginning of this book. I got pen and ink and a volume of unwritten leaves forthwith, and carried them away to a lonely chamber in the thickness of a turret wall, a little forgotten cell some 6 poor feet across. And there solitary I have written, and still write, peopling by the flickering yellow lamplight that stony niche with all the brilliant memories that I harbour, letting my recollection wander unshackled down the wondrous path that I have come, and step, by episodes of pain and pleasure, by wild adventure and strange mischance, down, far down, from the ancient times I have brought you until now, when my ink is still wet upon the events of yesterday, and I cease for the moment. This, then, is all that there is to say, all but one suggestive line. I and yonder fair damsel have plighted troth under the apple trees out in her orchard. We have broken a ring, and she has one half of it, and I have the other. To morrow will we tell her father, and presently be married. 'Tis a right sweet and winsome maid, and together, hand in hand, we will rehabilitate this ancient pile, and dock that desert garden, and get us friends and troops of curly-headed children, and lie and bask i' the jolly sunshine of contentment, and so go hand in hand for ever down the pleasant ways of peaceful dalliance. Jove! My pen and a few poor minutes more from the bottom dregs of life. It is over. All the long combat and turmoil, all the success and disappointment, all the hoping and fearing. That which I thought was a beginning turns out to be but an ending. My hand shakes as I write, my life throbs, and my blood is on fire within me. I am dying, friendless and alone as I have lived, dying in a niche in the wall with my great unfinished diary before me, and with the grim briefness of my necessity. This is how it has happened. I had wooed and won Elizabeth Faulkener, and, on the day after she had come down into the forge, as was her wont, sweet and virginal, and I was there at work and took her into my arms. And, while we dallied thus, there entered on us the ancient scholar and the swart steward. Gods, that villain blanched and scowled to see us so, till his swart face was whiter than the furnace ashes. I took the maiden's hand, and, boldly turning to her father, told my love and its accomplishment, whereat she burst from me and threw herself upon his bosom, and, radiant with confusion, such a sweet country pearl as any prince might well have stooped to raise, she pleaded for us. Oh, 1,000 curses on that black fell shadow standing there behind her. The father, relenting, kissed the fair white forehead of that winsome girl. He bid Emmanuel bring at once a loving cup, and while that foul traitor reeled away to fetch it, he joined our hands and gave us, in tones of love and gentleness, his blessing. Then came back the scoundrel Spaniard, his lean, hungry face all drawn and puckered with his wicked passions, and in his hand a silver bowl of wine. Oh, Jove, how cruel it flames within me now! My sweet maid took it, and, rueful for the pain she had given black Emmanuel, spoke fair and gentle, saying how we would ever stay his friends and do our best to prosper him. And even I, generous like a soldier, echoed her sweet words, telling that fell knave how, when the game was played and finished, e'en the worst rivals might meet once more in good comradeship. And so, while the mean Spanish hound, with cruel jaw dropped down and hands a twitching at his side, turned from us, his tender mistress lifted the goblet to her lips and drank. She drank, and because she was no courtly goblet-kissing dame, she drank full and honest, then passed the troth cup to me, and I laughed and swept aside my Phrygian beard, and happy once more and successful at the pink of my ambition, pledged those friendly two, pledged even yon black-hearted scoundrel scowling there in the shade, then poured all that sweet, rosy-tasting love-cup of promise down my thirsty throat. Gods ! What was that at bottom of it ? A pale, bitter white dreg. Oh, Jove, what was this ? I dipped a finger in and tried it, while a dead hush fell upon us four. It was bitter, bitter as rue, cold, horrible, and biting. My fingers tightened slowly round the goblet stem. I looked at the sweet lady, and in a minute she was swaying to and fro in the pale light like a fair white column, and then her hands were pressed convulsive for a space upon her heart, while her knees trembled and her body shook, and then, all in an instant, she locked her fair fingers at arm's length above her head, and with a low wail of fear and anguish that shall haunt for ever that stony corridor, she staggered and dropped. Down went the goblet, and I caught her as she fell, and there she lay, heaving a moment in my arms, then looked up and smiled at me, smiled for one happy second her own dear smile of love and sunshine, then shut her eyes, trembling a little, and presently lay still and pale upon my bosom, dead. Fair, fair Elizabeth Faulkner ! I held her thus a space, and it was so still you could hear the gentle draught of the curling smoke filtering up the chimney, and the merry twitter of the swallows perched far above upon it. I held her so a space, then kissed her fiercely and tender once upon her smooth forehead, and gave the white girl to her father. Then turned I to the steward, the bitter passion and the deadly drug surging together like molten lead within my veins. So turned I to him, and our eyes met, and for a moment we glared upon each other so still and grim that you could hear our hearts pulsing like iron hammers, and at every beat a long year of terror and shame seemed to flit across the ashy face of that coward Iberian. He withered and grew old, grew lean and haggard and pinched and bent in those few seconds I stared at him. Then, without taking an eye from his eyes, slowly my hand was outstretched and my sword was lifted from the anvil where I had thrown it. Slowly, slowly I drew the weapon from its sheath and raised it, and slowly that villain went back, staring grimly the while, like the dead man that he was, at the point. Then on a sudden he screamed like a rat in a gin and turned and fled, and I was after him like the November wind after the dead leaves. And round the forge we ran, fear and bitter, bitter vengeance winging our heels. And round the anvil with its idle hammer and cold half-welded iron swept that savage race, round by where the pale father was bending over the soft dead form of his sweet country girl, round the ruined chaos of the great broken engine, round by the cobwebbed walls of that gloomy crypt, round by the clattering heaps of iron in a mad, wild frenzy we swept, and then the Spaniard fled to a little oaken wicket in the stony wall, leading by many score of winding steps far out into the turrets above. He tore the wicket open and plunged up that stony staircase, and I was on his heels. Up the clattering stairs we raced. Gods, how the fellow leapt and screamed! And so we came in a minute out into the air again, out on to old Adam Faulkener's ancient roof, out all among his gargoyles and corbie steps, with the pleasant summer wind wafting the blue smoke of luncheon time about us, and the courtyard flags far, far down below. And there I set my teeth and drew my sinews together, and wiped the cold sweat of death from off my forehead, and stilled the wild strong tremors that were shaking my iron fabric, and, lost in a reckless lust of vengeance, crouched to the spring that should have ended that villain. He saw it, and back he went, step by step, screaming at every pace, hideous and shrill, back step by step, with no eyes but for me, back until he was unknowing at the very verge of the roof, back again another pace, and then, Jove, a reel and a stagger, and he was gone. And, as I rushed forward and looked down, I saw him strike upon the parapets 100 feet below, and bound into the air, and fall and strike again, and spin like a wheel, and be now feet up and now head, and so, at last, crash with a dull heavy thud, a horrid lifeless thing, on the distant stones of that quiet courtyard. It is over, and I in turn have time to laugh. I have come here to my secret den in the thickness of these great walls, staggering slowly here by dim steep stairs and rare trodden landings. Here to die. And I have double locked the oaken door, and shot the bolts, and pitched the key out of my one narrow window slit, and, gently rocking and swaying as the strong poison does its errand, I have thrown down my belt and sword, and opened my great volume once again. Misty the letters swim before me, and the strong pain ebbs and flows within. All the room is hazy and dim, and I grow weak and feeble, and my heavy head sags down upon the leaf I strive to finish. Some other time shall find that leaf and me a dusty ancient remnant. Some other hand shall turn these pages than those I meant them for. Some other eyes than theirs shall read and wonder, and perhaps regret. And now I droop anon, and then start up, and the pale swinging haze seems taking shapes of friendliness and beauty. There are no longer limits to this narrow kingdom, and before my footstool sweep in soft procession all the shapes that I have known and loved. Electra comes, a pale proud shade, sweeping down that violent road, and holding out her ivory palm in queenly friendship. And Numidia trips behind her, and nods and smiles. And there is stalwart Caius, his martial plumes brushing the sky. And earlier Sempronius, brave and gentle, and jolly Tullus, and two, a trooping band of ancient comrades. Now have I looked up once more and laughed, and here they come trooping again, those smiling shadows, and the fair Thane is with them, her plaited yellow hair gleaming upon her unruffled forehead, and by either hand she leads a rosebud babe, who stretch small palms towards and voiceless cries upon me. And white-bearded Senlac, and two, my Saxon serfs and franklins come gliding in. And there strides gallant Codrington, leading a pale shadow all in white, and Isobel turns a fair pale face upon me as she goes by. Oh, I am dead, dead, I know it, all but the hand which writes and the eyes that see, and I laugh as the last fitful flashes of the pain and life fly through the loosening fabric of my body. And now a hush has fallen on those silent shades, and their hazy ranks have fallen wide apart, and through them glides ruddy Blodwen. Blodwen, who comes to claim her own, and, approaching, looks into my eyes, and all those stately shadows are waiting, two, for us two to head them hence. And she, my princess, my wife, has come near and touched my hand, and at that touch the mantle of life falls from me. Blodwen, I come, I come. End of chapter 24. End of the wonderful adventures of Phra the Phoenician, by Edwin Lester Arnold. Read by Phil Benson in Sydney, Australia.